Hebrew 4. Without further ado, I give over to Solomon Paulsen to bring the memorial lecture regarding the founder is Solomon Adrians. Thank you, Solomon.
Good evening, everybody. Reverend Indley and your fellow clergy and invited guests and members of the Church Council and also members of this church. As you heard, my name is Solomon, but everybody calls me Solly, so that's fine. And I am very much, as David has indicated, a son of this church. I got a brief from Reverend Indley, and it was to sketch the history of this church. When I thought about it, I was reminded of the Maori term, and the Maori term is a term known as whakapapa. I'm not swearing at anybody, please. It's how they pronounce it. WH they pronounce as if. I mention that because the Maori people are the indigenous people of New Zealand, and they are very proud of their heritage. And when one delves into their heritage, they refer to it as whakapapa. A well-known rugby player, and I put this in specifically for Clive, knowing his liking of the Springboks and rugby, his name is Dan Carter. He was a fly-half who taunted the Springboks, and when he retired, he wrote his autobiography with the title, The Art of Winning. And I put that in specifically for Clive because I know he's an ardent Springbok fan. And any other Springbok fans. He, in his book though, on a serious note, refers in chapter 2 to whakapapa. And whakapapa is what Maori people say, is where do we come from? In fact, Carter, if I may quote him, says, a culture needs to absorb the legacy of those who have gone before, and yet also point towards the future. So there are two time zones. What happened before? Where are we going? I regard that very much as what we are doing this evening. We are looking back to how we arrived at this point and should ponder what the future has in store for this congregation. To understand the history of the establishment of this congregation some 75 years ago, we will end in Deep River, but we need to go way beyond Deep River. And we need to understand the context of the people and the situation in Southfield, and those who contributed unstintingly towards where we are tonight. We need to go to Southfield and that community that lived around Princess Fly Road in Southfield. The people that lived there were very humble people, and one surname that was dominant in that situation was the surname Adrians. Now, I want to start beyond the Calvinist church in Southfield, and bear with me, please. My great-grandfather was a man by the name of August Adrians. Him and his wife, Omarosi, were two people who played a leading role in what was originally known as the slave church. The slave church, not in Southfield, in Wynberg. And that church is still there and is now known as the Uniting Reformed Church in Afrikaans, VGK, Verenigde Gereformeerde Kerk. This church is still there on the corner of Elleville Road, and it's no longer a slave church, but originally it was started for the slaves and servants. And this August Ahrens and Omarosi, they played a role in both the church as well as in the Sunday school. Before I was born, they lived in Princess Flay Road in Southfield, next to where I grew up, and their house was named as Augustine. You can see where the association comes from. Opa Gis, as we knew him, was a man who had the community at heart. He was not only a church leader, but he was very much a community and people's person. He was the one who established an organization that still meets here on a monthly basis. What am I talking about? Southfield Hope and Doodgenootskap. And he established that organization over 100 years ago. His vision and his initiative drove him to establish a branch of the DRC Mission Church in Southfield. And I purposely say DRC Mission, because if you were a person of color, you were not a member of the DRC Church. You were a member of the DRC Mission Church. And I emphasize that because I think that mission word played an important role in the establishment of what we know now as the Calvinist Church. Now, people from Southfield, from Parkwood Estate, from Grassy Park, and what was then known as the Dorpie in Stierhof, they attended that church. The church and a number of other buildings were possession at the southern tip of what is now Plumstead Cemetery. That church and its precincts consisted of a church building, a school, and a cottage. And I know I may be digressing a bit, but people like Old Man van der Ross's wife was the principal of that school. And that school building was situated on what is now the corner of Bramley Road and Princess Flay Road. The people not only attended church there, but there was also a school. And the school was a wooden iron building, and we popularly talked about the Blick School. And it was at that Blick School that I was educated for a start. And you know, again, if I may just digress for a minute, my Uncle August, was the principal there eventually. And my mother taught at that school. So you can understand I had a tough time at school because she was a very strict old mom teacher. And but I'm not sorry. I say thank you to her today for the way she reared me and the way I was educated. After the death of Opa Agis, Opa's son, that David referred to as Solomon Johannes Adrians, he stepped in, took up the cudgels in the church, and also not only in the church, but in the community. He was a remarkable man. And if I can just, for a moment, talk to you about him. First of all, he had a very good name. I mean, he had my name. No, sorry, the other way around. and He was a man who was also a community man. He was an activist and also a community leader. He had a strong sense of justice. Short man with a bushy moustache, and had no hesitation in telling you what he thinks about things. Not everybody agreed with him, but his attitude was probably very much like mine. Why worry about what they think? I know what I believe in. And his strong sense of justice led him to become increasingly disenchanted and dissatisfied with this DRC mission church that was established there and that him and other people belonged to. Of course, we know that during all of this time, in 1948, Dr. D.F. Malan, a theologian, won the election in this country. Of course, we know we weren't part of the electorate because it was for them, wasn't it? And the Malan regime, they intensified the apartheid policy that was policy in this country. A policy that my grandfather fought tooth and nail. He would not have any part of that. He was a man who had no time for discrimination. And racial discrimination for him was a no-no. He didn't have time to waste for that, and those of us who remember him as a man who was clear thinking, a man who would state his viewpoint. Some interesting idiosyncrasies about him was he was also a man that had many talents. People now talk about women that are multi-skilled. So was he. And he taught me how to prepare the melon by pricking it for confit. Yeah, and he showed us, he was very astute. He showed us how to do it with two forks at the same time. And I admired him for the way he went about his business. Of course, with him there was Omar, and Omar was probably an even more astute person. Why do I say that? Because she could see he was to the forefront and she remained in the background and did her thing. Talking about confit, she was very adept at making moss bolletjies and making rusenki brood. And we looked forward to, in the church, context of the church, to Wednesday evening bidtier, because then the moss bolletjies would arrive with a rusenki brood for us. Anyway, that aside, in about 1950, Opa Saul, as he was known, everybody knew Saul, not Solomon Adrians. Opa had become so disillusioned with the mission church that he took a number of people with him from that Southfield DRC church, and they met in a hall further down the road in Princess Frey Road. The hall was a hall that was built right opposite where we lived. And if I can again just share some information with you, that hall was a hall that was built by the South Peninsula Benevolent Society. That organization was registered under the Friendly Societies Act, and It was actually, in reality, when I think of it now, it was actually a stokvel that was established for Opa's sons, family, and their family. It was a property stokvel. I always think of Opa as a man who had vision, who had forethought, who said, let's do this, otherwise it will be difficult for you people to become property owners. And I know that's not part of the church history, but it is part of what became the home of that church then. Excuse me. Initially, the people that broke away from the DRC Mission Church with Opa, they met with a congregational denomination. And they had made overtures to Reverend Moore and Reverend Abramse, two ministers in the congregational church. But I don't think things went as well as they wanted it to go. That was in a way used as an interim measure. Because what they then did, Opa and this group, they met with Reverend I.D. Morkel, and they had discussions with Reverend Isaac Morkel, who had in the meantime started the Calvinist church in Athlone. David was talking about older people. I was a young schoolboy then, and I was there on the day when Reverend I.D. Morkel was on the back of a truck with his megaphone, and people followed that truck to the site of the church in Athlone. It was actually a very interesting experience. I must add that my father looked at me askance because I hadn't said I was going to be there. I just got into the train at Southfield and walked my way down the road. But it was an experience that I haven't forgotten. Some of the leading lights when these discussions with Reverend Morkel took place were Brother Christians, A.D. Willemse, my father, and Uncle Willie Willemse. And they made a decision to join up with the Calvinist church. They set up a branch of the church in Southfield. That branch was serviced by people like Reverend Lindeboom, Langeveld, Foster, and amidst all of this, Opa was the pioneer here. And I want to at this stage say, please, if I don't mention your father or your mother, forgive me, but Opa was the pioneer. He was the one that took the rap and took the lead. He often used a text to encourage that small group of people. And what is that text? God loves a willing giver. And Opa inspired the congregation and encouraged them. Now, before I get too carried away with Opa's role, let me say, there was a church council. That church council met on the 17th of May of 1951. Some of the names that were part of this church council, Brother Seegers, J.C. Paulsen, that's my father, Uncle Ryan, who lives just across the road here, they met in that hall. By the way, that hall, which was built by the South Peninsula Benevolent Society, is the same hall where the first classes of South Peninsula High School started. And I can remember very vividly, you know, still being at primary school and seeing these classes held in that hall. It was interesting that the hall had to be petitioned, movable petitions for the different classes to take place. Excuse me. The congregation was not big, but when one thinks of family ties, you think of the Adrianses, Willemse, Albrecht, and other families like that. Although the first meeting of the church council was on 17th of May 1951, the day on which the church was deemed to celebrate its establishment was the 24th of June. And on the Saturday nearest the 24th of June every year, there was a celebration in typical Oupa style, bring and buy, a fight to raise funds for the church. During the early 1960s, the Group Areas Act was proclaimed and became part of the legislative structure under that law. And under that law, people in Southfield, people in Southfield, in Steerhof, Deep River and so on, they were not counted. Why? Because that area was then declared a white area for the one part of the population. Now this law was applied viciously and vigorously by law enforcement people. I can remember that my father at that stage was over 60. And what happened? They came along and said, "You better move or else." And they actually took him to court because he wouldn't move. The irony of all of that was that my father had a brother who was a white man on the Wild Coast. It was interesting. Somebody asked me about my family the other day. I would like to share more information with about that. Because it was for me a contradiction in terms that sort of thing happened. But it affected the church as well, because the law forced change in residence for the people, which means that the church also had to move. In 1961, Oupa Saul passed away, and the mantle of leadership was taken over by my father, James Charles Paulsen. He was ably assisted by Brother S.J. Adrians, Mr. Fritz, Mr. Albrecht, Uncle Avi, Solomon, and Uncle Charlie Africa. The cruelty of the Group Areas Act forced people from Southfield and Steerhof and Deep River, and many of them had to relocate to all other parts of the peninsula. A core of people, though, took up residence here in Pumps Estate. And my father became sort of the go-between between the Punt brothers, because this was farmland, and people that wanted to buy a plot in this area. So a core of people ended up living here, and with my father in the lead, with my brother who lived opposite here, with Uncle Solly, Clive's father, with Uncle Charlie, William's father, they secured some land here at a very reasonable price. The hall was first erected, and thereafter the church. On the 11th of December of 1966, the congregation bid farewell to that hall in Princess Fleur Road, Southfield, to take up residence as a congregation here. The hall is still there. It's now called the Moth Hall. And the moth is white retired soldiers, isn't it? Member of the Order of Tin Hats, moth stands for. The farewell service was conducted by the moderator of the Calvinist Church, Dr. Morkel, who used the appropriate text from the book of Exodus chapter 14. And he focused on verses 14 and 15. What did those verses, or what do they say? The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. And I think it is very appropriate because people were then forced to move on. It was a sad day of departure because the church and its precincts had been established by the sweat of the brow of a nucleus of people. And I am sure words will not be able to capture the essence of disappointment, of sadness, and of anger amongst those people. In the inaugural text at this hall, Reverend Morkel quoted from Haggai chapter 2, verse 9. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty. And I think when I see what has been achieved, how appropriate an act that was. And I must say that since the 1960s, much has been achieved by this congregation, including the construction of this church building, which was inaugurated in 1984. Sadly, many of the people who labored here have departed. I think of my late father, my late brother, late Uncle Solly Adrians, late Brother Charles Africa, and even one of the ministers, Reverend Trump. I felt guilty after I read my notes and thought, but hang on, it's all right to talk about my father and my brother and Uncle Charlie and all of those, but each one had a wife, and I must give credit to their wives who supported them and held this church together in many ways. I think, for example, of Auntie Delia Africa. I think of Auntie Lizzie Adrians. I think of Auntie Christine Williams and a number of other people that also worked with their husbands and their families to grow this church to where it is now. I want to conclude, and I'm not going to be like the ministers, you know how they say lastly, and then finally, and then in conclusion 10 minutes later. I just want to conclude and say, the Persian philosopher Khalil Gibran, he wrote a book called The Prophet. And in that book he says, the moving finger writes, and having read, moves on. What is he saying? Our survival is by moving on. He also wrote on page 13 of that same book, The Prophet, and stand together, yet not too near together, for the pillars of the temple, they stand apart. I thank you for the privilege to share these thoughts with you, and I wish you well over the next 75 years.
Ja.
Dank je.